Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs, et bonjour à tous et à toutes. My name is Stuart Beck, and I am President and CEO of the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. I would like to welcome you to today's dialogue, China in Asia, Implications for Canada. First, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that the places Canadians call home are the traditional territories of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. APF Canada is headquartered, and I myself live on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. We are grateful to the Coast Salish for their stewardship of these lands, and we collectively are committed to the process of reconciliation. For those who do not know the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, we are a not-for-profit organization focused on Canada's relations with Asia. Our mission is to be Canada's catalyst for engagement with Asia and Asia's bridge to Canada. Our research covers 6 pillars: trade and economic issues, geostrategic issues, digital innovation, sustainability, building Asia competence for Canadians, and finally, determining Canadian attitudes and perspectives on relations with the region. One of the Foundation's signature products is our national opinion poll. For the past 16 years, we conducted regular nationwide surveys to assess Canadians' attitudes towards countries in the Asia-Pacific and their perceptions of Canada-Asia relations. The 2020 National Opinion Poll, which will be released publicly next month, documents the opinions of 3,500 plus Canadian citizens and permanent residents, and is our first omnibus poll since 2018. While the NOP results touch on countries across the region, this year's results show a significant drop in public sentiment towards China. As a scene setter, I would like to provide insight into 3 areas on our questioning on China. When asking the question whether the rise of China is considered more of a threat than an opportunity, Canadian opinions about China have hit a 16-year low. Only 35% of respondents agree that China's growing economic power is more an opportunity than a threat, down from a 60% high in 2018. When asking Canadians if they are open to investment from broader Asia than they are from China, in high-tech sectors, 72% of Canadians support Japan's investments. 62% support investment from South Korea, and 52% support investment from India. For the biomedical and healthcare industries, 70% support investments from China, 61% from South Korea, and 52% from India. China, however, receives less than 35% support for all sectors. On the question of the human rights situation in China, only 20% of respondents think China's human rights situation has improved over the last 10 years, which is down from 35% in 2016. And 85% of Canadians believe that the Canadian government must engage with Asia on human rights. Now I have a few housekeeping notes before handing over the floor to the Foundation's Vice President of Research, Dr. Jeffrey Reeves, to introduce our distinguished speakers. This webinar is currently being recorded and will be available on our website 2 to 3 days after today's event. We welcome your participation in the later half of the dialogue and encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A box located at your screen's bottom. If we do not have a chance to answer your question, please feel free to reach out to us offline. For technical support, contact events@asiapacific.ca. Now I would like to turn the mic over to Dr. Jeff Reeves. Jeff joined the Foundation in January 2019 from the U.S. Army War College. He has over 15 years of direct experience living and working in Asia. Jeff has published extensively on economics, politics, and security in Asia, and his most recent policy paper for the Foundation is Canada and the Indo-Pacific, diverse and inclusive, not free and open. Now over to you, Jeff, to introduce our speakers and to moderate the session.
Thanks, Stuart. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to our speakers and guests. As Stuart said, I'm Jeff Reeves, the Vice President of Research at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. And it's my pleasure to moderate today's event, which I'm certain will be provocative and informative considering the excellent speakers who've agreed to convene with us today. So a quick word on format before I turn the floor over to the first speaker. This event will run for 90 minutes and it will consist of 3 different parts. First, we'll ask our speakers to make a set of scripted remarks in which they will offer their viewpoints on Asia, China, and Canada's place in Asia, and whatever other issues they deem of importance from their regional perspective. Second, I'll engage with the speakers through a 30-minute curated discussion to dive deeper into certain issues or to see if they have responses to any points raised, after which I'll open the digital floor to audience questions. If you have a question, please type it into our comment box and our research staff will collate and collect the questions for this final part of the discussion. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can, which means we'll be lumping some questions thematically together in order to provide opportunities for other people to ask questions. Now, a bit of hope of what we hope to accomplish today through this dialogue. It's our belief that the Asia-Pacific remains a priority area for Canada in terms of its national interests, whether defined in economic, political, or security terms, and that critical thought around the region's challenges and opportunities is necessary to develop effective national, provincial, and even commercial approaches to the region. Now, this is arguably truer now as aspects of the existing order in Asia are coming under strain, the result of the COVID pandemic, US-China competition in the region, shifting investment and trade relations with the potential to create, in the words of Professor Danny Quah, a bifurcated Asian marketplace, and the rise of an Indo-Pacific ideal that reshapes the Asian region's conceptual parameters and is leading to a loose partnership of democracies within the region. Equally, Asian order is becoming in some ways more inward-looking, the process of China's growing influence, a rise in regional institutions like ASEAN and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and dialogue mechanisms like the ASEAN Plus formulations and the Conference on Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia. And of course, the consolidation of economic relations between Asian states themselves and within Asian institutions. Now, within this push and pull environment in Asia, it's uncertain how Canada can best engage, particularly at a time when Canadians are increasingly wary of the country's place in the Asia-Pacific, as we've seen in our latest national opinion poll. It is our foundational purpose, as well as the purpose of today's dialogue, to engage with these developments in ways that inform a Canadian regional approach. Now, part of thinking through these problem sets for Canada is hearing from and learning from divergent regional perspectives about issues including Asia's strategic environment, China's foreign policy, and national strategies towards the region. And to that end, we couldn't have three more suitable speakers with us today. Now, I won't take any more time going over our speakers' CVs, except to say that Dr. Teresa Fallon, Dr. Vikram Singh, and Ambassador Billahari Khalsa are three of the most accomplished and thoughtful academics, thinkers, and practitioners we could have hoped to assemble here today. We encourage you all to take time following this discussion to search for their works on the Asia-Pacific, to understand the breadth of their respective contributions to the field of Asian studies. To start, I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Fallon, who, among other positions, is the founder and director of the Center for Russia, European Asian Studies in Brussels. Dr. Fallon will talk a bit about developments in Europe and with certain European states with respect to the Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific ideal, and relations with China, among other topics. Dr. Fallon, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Okay, all right. I want to give a warm welcome from Brussels. I'm so delighted and honored to be here. Thank you to the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada for the invitation and to Jeff Reeves. I'm a huge fan of Canada and I've had the chance to visit your beautiful country. Also over the years, when I was posted to Moscow and Beijing, we had very good relations with Canadian ambassadors and Canadian friends that I've been able to keep in touch with over the years. So it's really an honor and a delight to be with you today. So in my talk, I'm going to cover three things. I'll first start with a brief sketch of the evolving EU-China relations, followed by their Indo-Pacific, their emerging Indo-Pacific strategy. And then I'll close with ways that Canada and EU can possibly work together going forward in the future. So, as everyone in the world has probably experienced, especially in the post-COVID-19 environment, the relations especially with EU-China relations were already on a downward trajectory prior to COVID-19. So I see it as COVID-19 actually was a catalyst and actually made things deteriorate even more rapidly. First with mass diplomacy, then it morphed into wolf warrior diplomacy. So recently we had the EU-China summit. It was held virtually because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And although there were promises made at the last EU summit in 2019 on deliverables, which included the CAI, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, there was no progress made. Now they have till the end of the year to complete this agreement, but it doesn't look very likely. So this has created even more tensions with the EU. Now, traditionally, the EU tends to see the world as through a trade lens, but with the new commission, beginning in December 2019, they announced themselves as a geopolitical commission. And they are looking more at their neighborhood, which is becoming far more contested. And so we see troubles with Russia, also even with China. So we're trying, the EU is trying to see the world through a geopolitical lens, which is a new development for them. They traditionally had looked at and framed the world through a trade lens. So we're seeing, initial baby steps in this area, but it's growing. All right, so last year at the EU-China summit, they had a new white paper out, and it described China as a systemic rival. This is the first time that had happened. It also described them as a competitor, but also as a cooperative partner. So this kind of three-way dividing of the EU-China cake actually really concerned Beijing, because they were worried about this new framing, especially the term systemic rival. And they were unable, the council was unable to embrace this new language because some member states inside the council were unable to get this confirmed. But this year it was actually confirmed. So we see that previous holdouts, different countries in the EU, now everyone is on the same page, that everyone in the EU sees it as a systemic rival. So let's move on now to the Indo-Pacific. France has always been a leader in this region, largely because of their blue territory. They have several islands and 1.6 million French citizens living abroad in this region. They have always been very active on this. For example, in 2016 at the Shangri-La Dialogue, Le Drian had announced this idea of the EU working together. It didn't really gain much traction in 2016. By 2018, France had come up with their own white paper on the region. In Brussels, no one says the term yet Indo-Pacific. It hasn't been framed that way yet. So the newest addition to this narrative now is the German white guidelines that were published recently on the Indo-Pacific, which is also part of the German presidency of the rotating presidency for 6 months, in which Merkel is heading it. So this, the vision of the EU, the German presidency, was to have this amazing investment agreement with China on one hand, but also to have an Indo-Pacific strategy on the other. So the timing of the release of the paper came right after Wang Yi's kind of firefighting trip to Europe. The Chinese are very much aware that public sentiment is turning against Beijing, and so they sent him on kind of a goodwill trip to Europe, which seriously backfired. Maybe you came across some of the examples. For example, the head of the Czech parliament traveled to Taiwan, and it forced Heiko Maas, the German foreign minister, to publicly make a comment in solidarity for all of the EU to support this political leader's visit to Taiwan. So we're seeing a real narrative change in the EU during this period. In addition, France has also nominated a special ambassador for the Indo-Pacific region. So going back to the German white paper, it's guidelines. And now after the guidelines were published, there was a lot of analysis on it. Some people described it as old wine in new bottles. But one of the key takeaways that I think many analysts missed was that they actually used the term Indo-Pacific, which, as I said earlier, is taboo. I found out the hard way. I organized a conference 2 years ago here in Brussels and found out many people had to cancel at the last minute because you can't use the term Indo-Pacific. It was kind of this unwritten or unsaid rule. But now we're seeing Germany, which is the prime partner of China. 40% of their exports of the EU to China are from Germany. So Germany sells more cars in China. It's a really key economic partner. Although Germany has intra-European trade, many German industries are able to lobby for their interests. So the change in language to systemic rival actually came from the BDI, the German Confederation of Industry, had a report. So 2 years ago, we could already see a souring in the relationship. And so this language, systemic rival, was picked up from that report and put into the EU China narrative of how the EU is framing the relationship. So Germany definitely leads on this. And the next 5 EU member states, if you put them all together, they don't even meet the amount of exports Germany has. So Germany tends to be the leader in this area. So, okay. And Canada, I know, is very familiar with wolf warrior diplomacy, and we're very concerned about the 2 Michaels here as well in Brussels. And we're also seeing, you know, I saw in Jeff's paper this idea, which way are you going to form it? But I think even though Europe does not want to get involved in the Quad, they seem to be, you know, showing far more and signaling far more interest in this region. So now I'm going to move on to, all right, so recently Germany, France, and the Netherlands tabled their approach to the Indo-Pacific. So it's going through the EU machinery now. It will be discussed, and there is a goal to have a joint high rep from the European External Action Service, as well as the Council, come up with a joint communique on this strategy. So we're expecting in the next 2 to 3 months. Things do move slowly, but this is a positive sign. So I'll go on now to the EU-Indo-Pacific Strategy. The EU recognizes it has an important stake in the Indo-Pacific region and should not remain a bystander. They have a firm desire to develop their own approach to this region for their collective stability and prosperity. The EU needs to define its own policy according to its core principles, which include multilateralism, openness, inclusiveness, and cooperation. The EU-Indo-Pacific approach will focus on 5 key issues. The first is to promote sustainable and rules-based trade. The economies of this region have seen strong expansion, and China alone accounts for about 1/3 of global economic growth. For many countries in the Indo-Pacific, the EU is the largest trading partner and one of the biggest investors. The EU has also had a new generation of FTA agreements with South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and Vietnam. These are designed to promote open trade and strengthen a level playing field. Future free trade agreements will include aspects of the Paris Agreement in line with the European Green Deal. So we're seeing this thread will go through all future trade agreements, the green, sustainable environmental goals of the EU. Second, they want to promote sustainable and rules-based connectivity. The EU-Japan Connectivity Partnership is a great example. New coalitions need to be established with like-minded countries and regional organizations in the Indo-Pacific. Also, the normative aspects of connectivity should be highlighted where the EU is recognized as a global rule maker. For example, on data protection or cybersecurity building on the EU-ASEAN joint statement, for example. Third, addressing global issues in a more coordinated and coherent manner. The Indo-Pacific region faces many shared challenges: public health, fight against pandemics, climate change, sustainable development goals, which include the area of human development, fight against poverty, and the blue economy will be a priority for sustainable use of marine resources. Everyone in the world is suffering from the effects of overfishing. Fourth, safeguarding strong and effective multilateralism. The EU needs to conclude a strategic relationship with ASEAN and encourage partnerships with other key stakeholders. And fifth, enhancing the security profile of the EU. As this region is subject to great power rivalry and distrust between regional actors, the EU has a strong interest in rules-based cooperation and connectivity, rather than rivalry and competition. Strategic sea lines of communication, which are vital for supply of goods and services and energy. So one of the areas that we can see Canada and the EU cooperate perhaps in the future, we just saw an EU NAV4 Japan joint exercise with Atlanta off the coast of Somalia. This might be one area of future cooperation with Canada. So, as Canada is a member of the transatlantic community, it has close ties to Europe, as a member of NATO, and as a member of the Commonwealth. In addition to trade ties with Europe, they share cultural bonds and values and need to work together to support a rules-based international order. Members of the transatlantic community need to get their own houses in order to prevent the decay of democratic institutions. We are finding a lot of paralysis here in Europe in regard to making policy on China because of certain EU member states blocking or watering down key statements and documents. As an analyst recently pointed out, that the pandemic will structurally change the global economy more than we think. The post-COVID-19 economic landscape impact that we can expect from this in the medium term is not promising for companies, families, or governments. It is hard to think of a more devastating shock to the world economy, and not just because of the immediate effects. It is time to rethink many of the basic principles of our economic model to mitigate these impacts, according to recent research by Natixis. Like Canada, Europe is also in the process of defining a strategy to address a changing strategic landscape in Asia and the emergence of China on the global scene. Canada and Europe have much to learn from each other and can benefit from mutual exchanges to define their strategies and approach the new challenges in Asia in a coordinated and therefore more effective way. I look forward to your questions and we can discuss this further. Thank you very much.
Dr. Fallon, thanks so much for your comments. I think we have we can tease some, I think, of the topics that you've raised and get a little bit more in depth during the discussion section. But right now, what I'd like to do is turn the floor over to Dr. Vikram Singh, who most recent of his long career in the Asia Pacific now serves as the senior advisor at the Asia program at the United States Institute for Peace. Dr. Singh, we look forward to hearing your perspectives on the US and Asia, as well as any other topic that you'd like to cover. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks. It's a real pleasure to be with you and this great audience all around the world and panelists in Brussels and Asia. And I'm here speaking to you from Virginia. So welcome from the United States as we move headlong into our upcoming election. So it's an interesting time here, and it's great to be with you. You know, at the very outset, I'm going to begin and end my comments by just mentioning the two Michaels, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. You know, obviously, you know, personally, I've known Michael Kovrig for almost 20 years, and I know that he never harbored any ill will, and I'm sure he never did anything to actually violate any Chinese laws. He's been totally transparent with Chinese interlocutors over his entire career. And it's a tragedy, and it's also a symbol of China's willingness to use what you might call horizontal escalation as it is in competition or has concerns with other nations. And it was a little bit chilling to hear Chinese officials recently say, you know, Americans better watch out if the United States detains suspected PLA spies in the United States. You know, China may not limit itself to detaining spies in response and sort of the old tradition of then having exchanges of intelligence operatives. China may choose to target students or business professionals or others. And I think that's part of I wanted to preface with that because that's part of the shadow that has come over China's relations, not just with the United States, but with many other partners. It really is we've got a growing sense of unease or even fear about China's longer term intentions. And when you see a lot of the what people would say is new resolve among Western countries to stand up to China, et cetera, what the Chinese view as efforts to contain China. I think it is not rooted in sort of just irrational fear, but it's rooted in an analysis of what China has been willing to do vis-a-vis its neighbors, vis-a-vis maritime claims and border disputes, be that with India or in the South China Sea or with Taiwan, be it with coercive measures against countries when they act in what China sees as being against their interests and extending the way in which China is seeking to extend its influence. And so, you know, you guys had offered us some framing questions. And I think, the first was about what we think about the strategic environment in Asia. And I think the strategic environment in Asia is really dominated now by a period of great flux. So as China consolidates what now is the second greatest military power on earth and is growing to be, on par with the greatest economic power on earth, what is the intention of China, and particularly China under Xi Jinping? And while there were lots of concerns prior to Xi Jinping's ascendance about where China would choose to go as it built its economic, military, political, and overall, global influence, I think under Xi Jinping that has turned into alarm bells. In the United States, there's sort of two trends, but all of the strategic thinking in the United States is governed by concern. It's the first trend is all about China, countering China, being proactive to sort of push back against what's seen as bad intentions on the part of the Chinese government. That's sort of the all about China lens. The second is a little more nuanced. It views Asia as the engine of growth, as Teresa was saying, for the global economy, an engine of innovation and a major opportunity zone for the United States and its allies and partners around the world. And basically it would focuses on what's that proactive engagement look like to create an environment that's essentially non-permissive for negative Chinese actions. And it's important to caveat this. I don't think there's actually anyone arguing that China shouldn't be making investments, that China shouldn't be partnering with countries, whether it's to build infrastructure, to invest in resilience in the face of climate change and all these other things that the Chinese talk about doing. The question is, what does this Chinese cooperation come with? What are the expectations that come along with that? With that partnership? And in many countries, we are seeing a lot more focus and concern on, okay, yes, we welcome the Chinese investment, but how is it going to be done? Is it going to be done in a way that is environmentally conscious, socially conscious? Is it going to employ and bring jobs to local communities rather than just to the Chinese workforce imported in for a project and things like that? But so the second frame basically says, let's invest in these partnerships and let's make it hard for China to be to sort of go to what might be the worst of China's potential intentions, right? And sort of frame it differently. But they're essentially the same thing in that they, if you guys recently put out a report on the free and open Indo-Pacific and kind of posited two different views, one that's sort of very anti-China and one that sees more collaboration and management. And I think the fact is, whether you're more of a hawk or less of a hawk right now, at least in the United States, you are following basically a rubric of defending a free and open Indo-Pacific. And by definition, not by sort of us imposing on China a sort of, you must follow this rule set, but just by China's own actions, China has made it seem that it is really not interested in the core things that would entail. So freedom of navigation, respect for international law like UNCLOS, non-militarization. And I think in the region, and we'll hear from Billahari later, but I think there's both a sense that we have to continue engaging, obviously, with China, our greatest economic partner for all the countries in the region, and a force that's not going anywhere, but also a growing cynicism about what it means to engage with China. Is a code of conduct actually going to be developed with China and the ASEAN states that accommodates the interests of the smaller countries, or is it just a means to sort of getting to acceptance of Chinese dominance of the South China Sea? The way I see certainly the United States trying to manage this is with a major shift in rhetoric, to be much more forceful in how it talks about China and the prospects for partnership. A lot of focus on greater regional engagement. A few examples, just Teresa was talking about the EU shaping its policy vis-a-vis China. There is a new EU-US dialogue on China, a diplomatic effort that is entirely new. Obviously, we've seen a lot more cooperation with the Quad, including the elevation sustained now over multiple meetings to the ministerial level of the Quad being United States, Australia, Japan, and India working together. We're seeing the United States not only offer more, but have more uptake from regional countries, especially ASEAN countries, for assistance in things like maritime security, information security, ways to try to protect against what might be sort of a Chinese pressure militarily or in the information space or in terms of, even political warfare. The Chinese are being very proactive in engaging in online communities, in shaping where Facebook and Twitter discussions go, in publications, in media. And I think there's a sort of a growing sense of needing to play catch up on that. And I see a lot more interest from countries in Southeast Asia and thinking about how they manage that aspect of Chinese power and how it's playing out in their own countries. And then there's a lot of affirmative things like Blue Dot Network for greater investments, for climate resilience, and other things like that. And this clean network idea for telecoms and 5G networks, trying to convince countries to sort of sign on to a set of principles that would help have secure networking in the future. And I think those are the kinds of things that we're probably going to see more of, and we're going to see more of them regardless of what happens politically in the United States. It's a pretty there's a pretty broad consensus that more steps need to be taken to try to protect against what might be ill intent on the part of China. Overall, what this means, of course, is that it's views of China are more negative in the United States than I've seen in my 20 years of doing this kind of work. And this is even before COVID. And when you look at the substance of what's been going on between the United States and China, the efforts to get a bilateral trade deal, the so-called phase one trade deal, that has not been particularly successful. It has not met, and it has not really even delivered what it was supposed to in the first couple of years. The overall trend of concern among the private sector in the United States about what it can continue to do in China and what it can do safely, and a view of sort of, I would call it a hedging practice, where it's China plus. It's not necessarily let's pull everything out of China, but where else in Asia can we build our production facilities? What can we do in Vietnam and Thailand and Malaysia and India to help have some resilience in our global supply chains? Not just because we're worried about disruption by natural disasters or disruption by things like COVID, but because we're worried about disruption by the Chinese state deciding it's angry at us for something and taking actions that sort of crush our business. And then all of this is in the long shadow of concerns about intellectual property and market access and currency manipulation that have been features of U.S.-Chinese relationships, concerns in U.S.-Chinese relationships for 20 years, but where for several years, certainly from WTO ascension until the rise of Xi Jinping, there was kind of an attitude of letting things slide, and that it was all a part of helping China build itself up. And the notion of wanting to contain China is kind of belied by the bending over backwards by the United States, Europe, and others to help China integrate into the global economy in the first place. I think what's happened is that's gone from an exciting opportunity to something to be alarmed about over the long term. And the other thing that's changing the tone, of course, is overall human rights posture in China. So aggressiveness towards neighbors, but then coupled with unparalleled cruelty in the detention of well over 1 million individuals in the Uyghur community in Xinjiang, the basically ending of the system of democratic governance in Hong Kong. These are also things that just are suggesting that, hey, China's trajectory is going to be overall inimical to Western democratic interests. And the narrative of mutual respect we hear from the Chinese, it's very rarely met by what I would see as a pretty fundamental question, which is, does the Chinese government respect free, open democratic systems, or does it simply seek to take advantage of free and open and democratic systems and exploit some of the weaknesses that come from having open access? The simplest example is, I pick up the paper and see, a Global Times inserts on a constant basis, and that is not something that's available reciprocally to Chinese citizens. Obviously, their information environment is highly controlled. Other things are simple. One of the things I noticed as a researcher years ago, when we struck a bilateral agreement to have to allow 10-year multiple entry visas. Well, all of my Chinese counterparts have 10-year multiple entry visas to the United States, or at least they did. And none of my American colleagues ever got anything more than a 6-month single entry visa to China if we were researchers. And so reciprocity is becoming a watchword. And it's something that shouldn't be viewed as anti-China. It should just, I think, be viewed as simple reciprocity. And it can be done ideally in a fairly dispassionate way. I think that we're at a very interesting point, because China is going to press its COVID advantage. The COVID advantage for China is that it managed it well. I mean, the fact is, China contained the outbreak, really crushed it. It took measures that would be very hard in most democratic countries, but it has managed to get itself back on track. It is seeing 4 or 5% growth again, and I think Chinese leaders will try to press this advantage going into the next year, as it has a recovery that is far faster than that of the United States, Europe, and certainly that of its neighbors like India. You think the Chinese authorities would see that, hey, this is a good time to press our advantage with India, and we see that happening up on the line of actual control, because it's going to be very hard for India to make the kinds of urgent investments it would need to make to stand up to China, even as it tries to recover from the COVID crisis. So I think that's going to be a really key thing to watch in 2021, is how China presses that recovery advantage that it's going to have. I think China is also going to use the pandemic to help accelerate its spread of sort of Chinese surveillance state technologies to partners all around the world. So there's a growing market for what China has to offer, from artificial intelligence to internet surveillance to internet management, firewall type tools. I think China is going to get more market share on the back of those, even as there's a lot of pushback on things like 5G from China. Really quickly, because I think I've run out of time, Canada's role in Asia is interesting, and I think often frustrating for Canadians' friends, I would imagine. Canada is an important economic partner, and obviously it has important economic relations, not just with China, but across the region. But it also finds itself, as we see with the two Michaels, really caught between many rocks and many hard places. So Canada is often going to be the victim of circumstance as other things play out in the Asia Pacific. And we've seen over the last few years, not just difficulty with China, difficulties with India, difficulties, Canada needs to, I think, come up with a sort of a strategic framework for its engagement in Asia. At its best, Canada is viewed as a real leader, from a standpoint of everything from humanitarian issues to environmental issues, to its democratic bona fides in the region. So I think there's a lot that countries in the region welcome, and economic engagement, especially on technology and energy, I think are also things that are very welcomed in the region. But increasingly, it's going to find itself pulled in these different directions, and doing more with the other powers in China, with ASEAN, with Taiwan, Japan, et cetera, is definitely going to continue to exacerbate Canada's tensions with China. So I think the challenge for Canada really is to figure out how it can best manage basically the push and pull of these multiple factors and try to keep the cooperation that's most important with China continuing, even while it takes a stand, and hopefully takes a stand on issues of human rights as well, such as the Uyghurs and issues in Hong Kong. And it may come with some significant costs. And so I think for Canadian officials, this really does become a challenging balancing act. Really briefly, with the election, people always ask me, what changes do I see? I mean, I don't think you'll hear China virus if the election goes against Donald Trump, so there'll be a rhetorical change. But I think the biggest difference would be there would be a renewed effort to try to manage, to try to cooperate on managing climate change, which has fallen by the wayside. But the other elements of potential cooperation with China, nuclear security, North Korea, those sorts of things, where we would try to find some common areas of interest and cooperate, those will largely remain the same. Thanks. I'm sorry if I went on a little long.
Thanks for your comments very much, Dr. Singh. To conclude, we have a final speaker, Ambassador Billahari Khalsa of the National University of Singapore. Ambassador Khalsa will take a bit to talk about the Asia-Pacific strategic environment, how the Chinese state influences this environment, talk a little bit about the strengths and liabilities of the US and China in their competition, and then talk a little bit about why the metaphor of this idea of a new Cold War in Asia and globally is inappropriate. So to make those points, Ambassador, over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. First of all, thank you for inviting me to talk to this forum. Some of you may know, or you may not know, I was once High Commissioner to Canada, and it's been some time since I've talked to a Canadian audience at a Canadian institution. Now, let me get straight to it because I don't want to take up too much time. When I am asked to describe the strategic environment in the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, you can choose your own term, I generally start with making two general points, and I'll do so today, and I hope the relevance of these points will become evident in the course of my presentation. The first point is that you cannot really exercise soft power without hard power. Hard power being defined as a combination of economic and military power. Effective foreign policy requires both hard and soft power, and it's simply wrong to think that the latter alone, soft power alone, can adequately substitute for the former. Second, and this is a bit more controversial, one of the most foolish statements I have ever heard in my almost 40 years as a diplomat was John Kerry criticizing Russia's actions in the Ukraine in 2014 as unacceptable 19th century behavior in the 21st century. Now, when I say this is a foolish statement, I do not mean that there was nothing to criticize about Russia's behavior. Of course there was. But this particular criticism seemed to assume that your adversary or your competitor should play by your rules or share your values and is somehow offside if it does not. But why should it? Just because you believe in them does not make your rules and values universal. You need hard power if your rules and values are not to be just brushed aside. Now, the most significant geopolitical fact of our times is China's emergence, or perhaps re-emergence, as a major actor in the Asia-Pacific, and increasingly globally as well. China's re-emergence is a quintessential hard power fact. Hard power is inherent in the four modernizations Deng Xiaoping announced more than 40 years ago. Hard power is also inherent in the fundamental goal that has animated the Chinese polity since contact with Europe in the 19th century exposed its weaknesses. Since the late Qing dynasty, China has sought the wealth and power that would enable it to defend its sovereignty and reclaim the real or imagined place in the region that it believes is its right. And if China decided to play by other people's rules, it was because it decided that those rules served that fundamental goal. And if that goal was achieved, that goal was not necessarily going to be competing with the rules. In fact, that goal implied a whole new set of rules. It implied a whole new set of rules because hard power competition is wired into the ethno-nationalistic historical narrative of national humiliation and national rejuvenation under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. And this is the narrative by which it increasingly, almost totally, legitimates its rule. Now, that historical narrative is essentially revanchist and is infused with a sense of entitlement and ethno-nationalist superiority. And underlying both the history and the nationalism is an older element of Chinese political culture that sees harmony or stability or order being only achieved by acceptance of hierarchy. Needless to say, with China at its apex. Now, it cannot be denied that the Chinese Communist Party has been the most successful of all the political experiments China has endured in pursuit of wealth and power. President Xi Jinping has been the most assertive and on occasion aggressive of post-Mao Chinese leaders in reclaiming what China believes to be its rightful place in the Asia-Pacific. But Mr. Xi did not invent this goal. It predated him and it will outlast him. China's fundamental goal made hard power competition with the US and other Asia-Pacific powers like Japan, Australia, Korea, and so India, among others, well nigh inevitable. And the only thing I find unusual about the current state of US-China relations is that the US was for so long hesitant to focus on strategic competition. That delay was perhaps because of the persistence of the curious delusion that economic reform would necessarily lead to political reform of some sort. That delusion was in turn due to a misinterpretation of the meaning of the end of the Cold War, not just as a geopolitical event, of course, a momentous geopolitical event, but having some larger quasi-metaphysical universal meaning. And that Western hubris seemed in China's eyes to confirm its own worst fears about what Western goals vis-a-vis China were, particularly when it saw how post-Soviet Russia was treated. On their part, Beijing did not seem to recognize that its own behavior that it was possible for others to overlook or downplay when China was weak and the Cold War was ongoing, is unacceptable now that China is strong and the West faced no existential threat from the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union obviously does not exist. Competition, however, is not conflict and need not lead to conflict. And the idea of a Thucydides trap in which China and America are destined for war has always struck me as extremely unconvincing. Nuclear deterrence makes war by design, and I emphasize war by design, highly improbable. And this is not to say that accidents or miscalculations cannot happen. But if accidents should occur in the South or East China Seas or in the Himalayas, I think both sides will act quickly to contain them and will succeed in containing them. The exception is the Taiwan Straits, where I think accidents can more easily get dangerously out of hand. Now, competition is a natural state of affairs among major powers. I find nothing unusual with it. But long-term US-China strategic competition is not a new Cold War. That is an intellectually lazy trope that distorts the essential nature of US-China relations. The US and the former Soviet Union led competing systems in principle, not always in practice, but they led competing systems and their competition was over whose system would prevail. China are both vital components of a single system and compete within that system. Xi Jinping is Davos man with Chinese characteristics. He has said so. He has defended globalization extremely eloquently. And the US and China, moreover, compete while entangled in a web of supply chains of a scope, density, and complexity never before seen in the global economy, and which certainly did not exist between the US and the Soviet Union. These supply chains distinguish the current type of interdependence from previous periods of interdependence, and both complicate and condition their competition. This new type of interdependence invests US-China relations with deep ambivalence because it exposes their mutual vulnerabilities and hence arouses deep mistrust. Neither the US nor China are comfortable with this situation, and some fragmentation of supply chains, of globalization in general in specific domains has already occurred, and more will occur as these countries and others try to mitigate their vulnerabilities and hedge against overdependence. But the very complexity, the very pervasiveness, density, scope of the supply chains, especially in the technology domain, makes total across-the-board decoupling of the US from China improbable as China creating an entirely new alternative system or becoming totally self-reliant. That's just not going to happen. This has created a more complex environment for all of us because the same ambivalence that characterizes US-China relations also characterizes the relationships of almost all countries in my region with China. And there's also a certain parallel in the way in which many, perhaps most countries in the Asia Pacific, including US friends and allies, regard the US and China. Both are regarded as important, vitally important. Neither can ever be ignored, but neither, for very different reasons, is particularly trusted. And this has been validated by many surveys. But the different reasons why they are not trusted are important. The US has, since 1969, been an offshore balancer. As an offshore balancer, the US is always going to either evoke fears of entanglement, and this is the case with the hard containment advocated by Secretary of State Pompeo, which is not an attractive option even to US allies. It's either going to evoke fears of entanglement or fears of abandonment, as occurred during the Obama administration, particularly in its second term. None of us would have said so at the time because we were, after all, diplomats. But Mr. Obama made pretty speeches and flattered the region by turning up at his meetings, but clearly had little stomach for the realities of hard power competition. Examples are available during question time if anybody wants to know some examples. And furthermore, let's not idolize American foreign policy before 2016 as some pre-lapsarian state of grace. Mr. Trump represents in an exaggerated form tendencies that have never been absent in American foreign policy and will not disappear after him. And not everything the Trump administration has done is wrong. Furthermore, after decades of sacrifices and exertions, Americans under any president are no longer in the mood to bear any burden or pay any price to uphold international order, and who can really blame them? Henceforth, American policy will be more transactional than in the past, serving domestic priorities first. Under a new president, if there is a new president, changes on core issues will be more of degree, process, and tone, not substance. There's no returning to the status quo ante because it no longer exists. At the same time, a big country like China has a duty of reassurance to the small countries around its periphery that it has singularly failed to perform. On the contrary, the sense of entitled superiority that infuses the Chinese Communist Party's ethno-nationalist historical narrative has engendered resistance and accentuated anxieties. China suffers from a persistent deficit of soft power, compounded and complicated by a certain cultural altruism in its policies. Now, don't misunderstand me, nobody will ever shun China, but I can think of no major country, not just in the Asia Pacific, but around the world, I can think of no major country that is without concerns about one aspect or another of Chinese behavior. Indeed, that is true of not so major countries as well. Not everybody has the same concerns or the same intensity of concerns, but Beijing has done far more than the Trump administration to create a loose anti-China global coalition. Now, does China know this? I think it's begun to know this. But while China may make tactical adjustments, I do not think Chinese behavior is going to fundamentally change because those objectionable behaviors stem from the essential nature of the Chinese state. Explanations, if any, are needed during question time. So our region, the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, is thus confronted with two hard realities. First, a more assertive, if not downright aggressive China, driven by an ethno-nationalism that infuses its policies with a deep sense of entitlement and superiority, but is a vital part of the global economy and therefore cannot be ignored or shunned. Second, a more transactional America that will define its interests more narrowly and whose reliability is thus more than usually suspect, but is also a vital part of the global economy and without whom no balance with China is possible. And this is particularly true in the South China Sea. To deal with these realities, countries will be reluctant to neatly situate all our countries in our region are reluctant to neatly situate all our interests along a single axis with either the US or China. Every country will simultaneously hedge, balance, and bandwagon. On some issues, the country's interests may lead it to tilt towards the US or towards China, or even align with the US or China. But it does not imply any obligation or necessity to align or arrange interests in every other domain in exactly the same direction. And on some issues, countries will go their own way, ignoring both the US and China. In other words, not all choices are binary, and we do not see all choices as necessarily binary. And this holds true of US friends and allies as well. And it holds true not just of the US, but of China. Now, this sort of flexible, fluid, and omnidirectional diplomacy has long been the norm in Southeast Asia, which has had to cope with major power competition for decades, if not centuries. And one of the essential, this is one of the essential, but very not well understood at all, purposes of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is to facilitate such an approach. Now, I'm not claiming that it's easy. It requires an agility of mind and institutions to recognize the opportunities to differentiate interests in a non-binary way, and the courage to resist the inevitable pressures that, no matter what they may say, will come from both the US and China to align with them. And I don't claim either that ASEAN always does it very well, but it is possible, and we have been doing it for a long time. And over time, I think this Southeast Asian diplomatic norm will become more general. And this will be facilitated by and entrench the natural multipolarity of the Asia Pacific. And that's a good thing, because multipolarity creates agency. Let me conclude with a few words about Canada. One of my first jobs in the foreign ministry as a young officer was to be desk officer for North America, which of course included Canada. And ever since Trudeau the Elder was Prime Minister, Canada has tried to position itself as an Asia Pacific actor. But it's always been difficult to give Canada's role in the Asia Pacific clear definition. And when I was High Commissioner in Canada, I sometimes found it difficult to get real attention. People will readily agree with you that Asia is important to them, but when it came to action, the definition of their interests began to fuzz a little bit. And I concluded there were two reasons for this. First, the sheer weight of your southern neighbor, the United States, is always a distraction and will always make Asia a secondary consideration. You have some very, very talented Asia experts in your universities and your government. I know some of them, but their expertise has always struck me as underutilized. And not too long ago, Canada even seemed for a time to entirely lose interest in the Asia Pacific. And I don't think this will be the last such episode. The second reason is a more fundamental one. Even within this unavoidable constraint of your location next to the United States, which looms so large in your economy, in your strategic consciousness, in everything, even within this unavoidable constraint, unless you are willing to make the necessary hard power investment in the Asia Pacific, which so far no Canadian government has been willing to do, you are never going to be more than a player in the fourth league in the Asia Pacific. The game in the Asia Pacific has always been, first of all, a hard power game, and has become even more so in recent years. No rules-based order can ever be upheld without hard power. In this game, the first league is occupied by the US, the second league by Japan and Australia, the third by India and South Korea. Canada, the EU, among others, are in the fourth league. And so I end where I started. Canada has immense resources of soft power. It is not regarded as threatening by anyone in the Asia Pacific, and I think Canada is admired by many in the Asia Pacific for many reasons. But without hard power, you cannot fully utilize the potential of your soft power. So your essential role is to put out one more flag in support of those who exercise hard power to uphold a rules-based order. I don't say this to demean anyone, but as a friend stating a simple fact. More flags are always useful and more flags are always welcome, but flags are just flags. Without hard power, you should have no illusions about where you stand and how far you can go. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Ambassador Khalsa, thank you so much for your comments. We have about a half an hour left on the clock. What I'd like to do is ask a couple questions of the speakers individually based on the specific perspective that they brought to this discussion. And then I'd like to throw out a couple questions that I'd like to get everybody's opinion on. Understanding that we have about, as I said, a half an hour left, and we have a good deal of questions, some excellent questions from participants that I'd like to get to. I've tried to work some of them into these initial questions and comments as well. Starting with Dr. Fallon, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the divisions within the European Union member states with respect to their views of China. Specifically, perhaps look at the 17+1 mechanism, talk about different involvement or different desires, levels of desirability from nation states for involvement with China, and how that's leading or how that's preventing a European-wide approach to not only China, but maybe perhaps to the Indo-Pacific as well. And then maybe, I think it would be also very interesting to get your perspectives on the future of the UK's approach to the Asia-Pacific and UK-China relations as well. I'll let you answer that question, and then I'll provide some questions for Dr. Singh.
Okay. Okay, can you?
I think we can't hear your, I think you're on mute. Yeah.
Please excuse me. The 17+1 is a sub-regional grouping. It's made up of 11 EU member states and 5 possible accession states. So it was originally 16. Last year, they added Greece because there was really no movement. So it appeared like there was movement. So it went from 16+1, the +1 is China. And last year they added Greece. So it's a 17+1. So if you're interested in like geopolitical strategy, Mackinder, the famed geostrategist, said whoever controls Central and Eastern Europe controls, this is a key region. And in a very short period of time, China has managed to create a new land-sea corridor. So starting with the Piraeus port in Greece, all the way up through Central and Eastern Europe to the Baltic. So it's absolutely incredible. So it can turn towards Russia and it can turn towards Europe. In addition, I mean, it was kind of, in the initial days, it was called a Trojan horse. And Brussels looked askance at this. It was very concerned about this. But especially the EU member states liked it because they got to meet with China's leaders. They were felt very important. And there was always this promise of a great deal of investment in the region. So several years later, there's a lot of promise fatigue. We haven't seen the expected promises. But in this region, you don't really need to invest a lot of money to get some influence. So we've seen one of the key takeaways is Hungary has been able to block and water down many statements. I just was sent a document yesterday from the European Parliament, and it's incredible how some have commented, someone has told me this, that they felt it was almost the words of the Chinese mission. The words of, putting some sentences into various documents really were mimicking what was happening. So this has really caused a problem. The first time we've seen this happen was back in 2016 with the EU, with the arbitral tribunal decision on Philippines versus China. And EU is actually a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, otherwise known as UNCLOS. And so they did not, everyone expected them to support it, to welcome the decision. Instead, because there was this rivalry within the 17, back then it was the 16+1, the EU could only acknowledge. So in diplomatic language, that's the lowest you can do. And so the Chinese embassy here in Brussels declared the EU neutralized, neutralized. And so this was a huge, these were the things that Europe stands for: multilateralism, rule of law, but they were unable to really come out strongly on this. And walking back to the German Indo-Pacific strategy, I noticed there is nothing in their UNCLOS. Rather, they talk about the COC, the Code of Conduct, which is a strange choice. In some respects, I think what the Code of Conduct is to ASEAN, the investment treaty is to Europe. So something that China always holds out and uses it as a carrot to get behavior that they want. So there have been some discussions of countries leaving the 17+1, for example, Estonia. They are signaling that they might be leaving. So has this been a success? Well, it depends. If you look at what they've done with the possible accession member states, so these are countries that would possibly become EU member states, but we've seen Serbia, one of the key countries that China has been investing in, and they also have defense cooperation. We've seen, Chinese drones being tested in Serbia. They have smart cities, this incredible authoritarian surveillance system. So it becomes more and more difficult for Serbia to actually join the EU. So we know the public wants to join the EU, but the leadership is actually getting pulled further away. And for example, during the COVID-19 crisis, we saw Vučić meet the plane, this plane delivering Chinese PPE, personal protective equipment for COVID-19. And Vučić, kissed the Chinese flag, but little do people know that the plane was actually paid for by the EU. So the EU has been really lax in the ability to get their message out, to communicate more effectively. The Chinese have been very, very good at that. Perhaps you can learn a few lessons from the way China is able to publicize what they've done. Whereas the EU is far a bigger investor and giver of aid in Serbia than China, but most people would perceive that it's Chinese investment in the future of China. In addition, China is a card to play. So China is far away. And we saw this also in Poland, but this narrative has evolved away in Poland. They saw it as a way to, kind of hedge against Russia. And also if they're unhappy with what's happening in Brussels, they can say they can turn to China. We see this continuing in Hungary, and Hungary is a very worrisome aspect of all of this. So I understand with the Indo-Pacific strategy, Greece, people have told me that they are very interested in cooperating on this. So the key country I would suspect would be Hungary will be a blocking agent. So will we see a very watered down, nothing burger statement? I don't know, we'll see. We can live in hope. And then just to pick up on the future of UK. So the UK under Cameron Osborne had the golden decade, and they were very pro, everything. Xi Jinping came, sat in the golden stagecoach with the Queen. There was a huge hoo-ha, everyone was very pro Chinese development. And now we've seen almost, massive turn, a China reckoning. Boris Johnson had almost died reportedly from COVID-19. Maybe that changed his perceptions. The intelligence agencies in the UK have long been monitoring Huawei, and for them to actually change their position on Huawei had a huge echo effect on the continent. So instead of the UK being close to China and having this golden decade, some have described it as turning into dust. And so the UK is actually acting as a pole. And once this happened, once the UK rejected Huawei, we saw the will increase in Europe. So France didn't say that, but because of their new legislation, it's clear that they will not use Huawei. Just yesterday, Sweden announced that they will not be using Huawei. The big holdout is Germany, and they have had a lot of cooperation with Huawei over the years. And this has a huge impact on Central and Eastern Europe as well, because of Deutsche Telekom and other German companies. They invested in the infrastructure, the telecommunications infrastructure in Central and Eastern Europe. So the decision of Germany will be key. And I imagine they're waiting for the outcome of the US election. They're just kind of spinning it, even though the German intelligence agencies have come out and say that they don't trust Huawei as a trusted vendor. In addition, the EU has a toolbox, I hate that word, but that's what they use here, in regard to Huawei and trusted vendors and 5G technology. And Angela Merkel almost undermined that by making a statement one day before this was released. So in some respects, Germany has been undermining EU efforts, and this is an EU member state competence. So the EU can only offer guidelines, and each member state will make up their mind. And then there's another actor in all of this, and it's NATO, because through NATO, the US is present, and they have made it quite clear with the last summit that it's a responsibility that member states have, safe telecommunications as part of being a member of NATO. So I think that this is gaining traction. We know that through coercive diplomacy, China has made many threats that if you don't embrace Huawei, as they did in the UK, you have a nice economy there, too bad if something happens to it. So we're seeing that there will be prices to pay. And I think the appetite in Europe, especially public opinion, it will make it far more difficult for the elites to embrace Huawei. I hope I've answered those questions for you. Okay.
Absolutely, thank you so much. I'm going to move on to just giving the questions that we're getting from the participants in order to make sure that we can get to as many as possible. So we have a question for Dr. Singh. Do you think that there's a place within the Quad for Canada? And do you think that if the Vice President Biden's quest for the presidency is successful, if the next American president is Biden, do you think there's a chance that his administration will consider entering into free trade agreements with Asian countries other than China? For example, perhaps reignite US interests in joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, as we call it here in Canada.
Yeah, great question. So I think the Quad is early in its sort of resurgence. So I doubt there's going to be much interest in trying to sort of pull more folks in. I could imagine some Quad plus things happening. So Quad exercises where fifth and sixth countries participate. Things of that nature. But I think it's a little early to expect there to be sort of a Quad expansion. More likely on the intelligence side, Five Eyes intelligence cooperation is going to focus much more heavily on China, and that of course involves Canada on a routine basis. And Ambassador Billahari can speak to this perhaps a little bit too. I mean, in ASEAN, the Canadians have often been interested in joining things like ADMM+, which is the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, which includes 6 outside powers, but doesn't include Canada. I think ASEAN has generally been a little reluctant to expand beyond what it has now, which is not about Canada per se, but just about keeping that core that they've sort of established and have a rhythm with. So I think it's been generally difficult for Canada to find a place in both the formal and the somewhat informal multilateral structures that it's not already in when it comes to Asia. But I could imagine if there was something, if Canada were to bring something to the table in terms of willingness to participate, say in a maritime exercise or something like that, I could see some potential for more ad hoc cooperation, but probably not like a Quint the Quad being turned into a Quint, I think is relatively unlikely. As for trade, as you know, trade remains extraordinarily contentious issue in the United States, and I don't think it'll be a first order of business to sort of jump back into the now CPTPP. And if it were to happen, it would probably have to come with a significant renegotiation, because I think that in order to make it politically viable, the United States would need to get additional market access, additional environmental and labor conditions, and so you might be really opening a can of worms for the CPTPP members, because you might have a situation where everybody sort of has to go back to parliaments and things like that. And I imagine there'll be talk about whether to do this, but I think it's a heavy lift, and I don't think it's going to be an immediate action.
If I could just ask all the speakers to go ahead and put on their videos as we come to the close to the end of this discussion. We have a lot more ground to cover. The next question is for Ambassador Khalsa. Do you think that improvements in trade and economic relations between the West and China would be sufficient to build trust to deal with political and security issues? And would a group of middle powers be accepted as kind of a tripolar presence by the United States and by China as a negotiating force to bring about a new international system?
Well, I don't think trade per se is going to build trust. In fact, one of the major reasons for the breakdown of trust between the US and China was trade, was American business. The American business was progressively disillusioned. Some of the practices that we object to in China is not, which I think are quite universally objected to, stem from one very simple fact, which is so obvious that it's almost invisible. China is a communist country, not in its ideology, but in its political structure. It is a Leninist country led by a Leninist vanguard party, whose interests override everything else. So if its interest is to take this piece of intellectual property, it will, right? We will just have to put up with it. If you want to do business with China, this is a reality you have to accept. How much you are going to stomach, everybody has to make their own decision. But China is not going to change. It's a Leninist state. Right? You think the group of middle powers can act as some kind of trade intermediary? I think this is a pipe dream. China prefers to deal with people bilaterally for obvious reasons. Because with bilaterally, China can deploy its immense weight on just one point. Mind you, that is also American instinct too. It's the instinct of all big countries. Huh? All right, so it's nothing unique to China. So I don't think there's any room for a trade intermediary of middle powers. However, I think there is room for middle powers to play a role in the Indo-Pacific. Not necessarily a trade role or only a military role, everything. What I said, you need to have hard power. You need to have some skin in the game. Because ours is a naturally multipolar region. And the more poles, the better. Because okay, if there's only one pole, whether it's US or China, there is no room to move for small countries. Absolutely zero room to move. A bipolar situation gives more room to move. But a multipolar situation maximizes the opportunity to exercise agency. So if Canada is there, great. But Canada is there only in one dimension. That's not enough. If Canada wants to join the Quad, you will have to deploy some military exercises to take part in, say, Exercise Malabar. Maybe you can do that occasionally, but that will take a lot of rethinking on your part of yourself and how you want to engage a region. Same, either way, for the EU. Huh?
We have about 10 minutes left, and I want to ask this question of all the participants. What are your views on how Canada, or what Canada can do to handle what Professor Paul Evans has called the 3 M's problem? So Meng Wanzhou and the 2 Michaels. And specifically for Ambassador Khalsa, what would Lee Kuan Yew do in this situation to address the challenges that Canada is having around Meng Wanzhou and the 2 Michaels?
Well, I think Mr. Lee, if he were alive, would not have got himself into the situation in the first place. And I think, I don't wish, as I said, I am a friend of Canada. I was High Commissioner of Canada, but why was Canada picked upon rather than the United States? Okay, I know what the Chinese have just said. I'm very skeptical they really do something. Playing around with the United States is a very different issue from playing around with Canada. Playing around, if they're going to play with somebody else, this kind of stupid hostage game, it may be the EU. I don't think they will even play around with India that way. It's just too dangerous. There is a reason they pick on Canada. I can't hear you.
Excuse me, sorry. For Dr. Singh, Dr. Fallon, do you have any advice for the Canadian government or the Canadian people on how to deal with Meng Wanzhou Michael's situation? I know, Dr. Singh, you have personal relations and have been involved in some advocacy in Washington, D.C. around this issue. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, look, I was and remain extraordinarily distressed on a personal, professional basis, and I think it's extremely chilling on a bilateral basis. Now, not that China would take some kind of action in response to what it sees as an unjust arrest and detention of Madame Meng by the Canadians on the U.S. request. I'm not surprised that they reacted negatively. I think what's alarming and disheartening is that they did this very cynical thing, which was basically they didn't seize Americans, they seized Canadians for just the reasons Billahari was saying, because they can pick on the Canadians, and they can afford to do it. They don't have to worry too much about the consequences, and it shows a sort of a cruel and tendency and a willingness to really pick on folks that have little recourse. I think the Canadians are in a real bind. Their best bet is letting this legal process play out and hoping that it results in an outcome that is favorable enough to the Chinese that they see their way to set this aside. If they wanted to play a little hardball, I suppose the Canadians could say, look, unless this moves forward, we're going to seriously consider releasing her at some point. But there's a lot of costs to be paid in that sense, because you'd essentially be bending to China's dictating to you how you follow the rule of law. And I think it's exceedingly difficult. I do hope that Canadian and U.S. authorities are talking about avenues here. There can be some legal maneuvering that might result in some sort of shifting of the legal burden from the individual back to the corporate entity. As we saw with ZTE prior, I don't know that arresting company officials in this way for sanctions violations is really a great trend in global governance. So there's some potential avenues. I can't really speak much about what might be being discussed behind the scenes, but I think the ideal thing for Canada is to avoid this kind of situation. The unfortunate thing for everyone is China's the demonstration effect from China is, hey, we are willing to do this. We are willing to take innocent hostages, and it's not wolf warriors so much as just thug warriors at that point. I hope that for Chinese leaders, eventually this starts to seem like a bad idea, that it's not really the image that China wants throughout the world, and it's not a tool that they're going to want to use widely and consistently.
Okay. I would agree with both Billahari and Vikram's points, especially this idea of thug warrior. I mean, China has spent can you hear me? China has spent millions on soft power, and then they do this type of behavior. And we also have the same here in Europe with Gui Minhai. He has a Swedish citizenship. He was a Hong Kong bookseller that was kidnapped in Thailand. And there have been some strange instances with his daughter and Swedish ambassador. But anyway, Europe understands this, and most people have been warned not to travel to China. So I think that this idea of soft power, China wants to be attractive, but the reality is that I'm seeing a whole generation of people who've been studying Chinese are wondering, why have I been doing this? What kind of future will I have? Do I even want to continue my studies? So Europe has actually a pretty narrow bench for Chinese experts, and I think that China's current behavior is actually thwarting people's interest in this field. So I think that will be the sting in the scorpion's tail. And as one analyst has said, this behavior is extremely unfortunate. I just read this terrible story how Michael Kovrig didn't even know about COVID-19. So talk about how information doesn't travel very far in China, and the terrible suffering of both of these people. One of them is actually also a Hungarian citizen, but the Hungarians, of course, he is a dual national, Michael Spavor. So the Hungarians aren't speaking about that. But I think that it's very important. We saw some cooperation when Wang Yi was in Rome. The Canadian ambassador was able to meet. So I think that this is a good move. And I think European diplomats and governments should do everything in their power to keep this on the international agenda. Every opportunity, it would look really bad for Wang Yi to say no for this meeting. So I think that that was a really smart strategy by Canada, and I really hope that we'll see an end to this rather soon. But it seems very bleak. I'm very sad and concerned about this.
Well, a bit of a sad note to end this discussion on, but we have
Sorry.
no, I think, but it's the reality on the ground. I think that unfortunately, as you said, a lot of the rhetoric that we're seeing coming both from the United States and from China is around securitizing that people-to-people relationship, where you've seen, for example, the reports coming from China around the Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying that American researchers might be targeted as they travel to China in retaliation to the FBI's furthering investigation into Chinese students with ties back to the PLA. A lot of concern, I think, about, as you said, people that have studied this space for a long time, have taken the time to learn the Chinese language, have taken the time to develop the contacts on the ground, wondering what the future of Chinese studies is going to look like if we don't have that assurity that we can travel to the United States or to China without some sort of without being arbitrary, without being detained. Unfortunately, I think that's the reality on the ground. Anybody, Ambassador Khalsa, I saw that you were moving to unmute your button. Would you like to make a final comment here?
No, I just want to say that, you know, I don't really think there's very much that can be done about the two Michaels. I think, as both of you said, they want you to break your own values about the rule of law. And that, I think, Canadians will not be willing to do. So it's an impasse. I don't think Mr. Wang Yi is the most important person in China on this issue. But I think you will just have to keep pressing on the best you can.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being part of this event today. Thank you very much to the speakers for your excellent comments. As always with these events, it feels like we could go another hour and a half easily without even scratching the surface of the expertise, certainly on the panel and the events that we would like to discuss. I'd just like to key up the fact that this event, while it's a standalone event, is a bit of a precursor to what we hope to accomplish as a foundation in early 2021 around a series of events that we're labeling the Vancouver Asia Dialogues. So we will be running them here in Vancouver, virtually, unfortunately, probably considering the restrictions around being able to travel right now. But what we do hope to do is convene experts like the three that we have done today, to discuss issues that have direct relevance to Canadian involvement in the Asia Pacific, and to get insights from both the Asia Pacific region, from Europe, and of course from the Americas. So we accomplished that here today, and we're going to do more of it early in 2021. Please watch the space for those events as they come out. Thank you very much to the speakers for your time today, and thank you again for the participants. And I'll turn it over to our CEO and President, Stuart Beck, to give the final comments here today and wrap up the proceedings. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Jeff. And I would really like to, my thanks to Teresa and Vikram and Ambassador Khalsa. You guys did a wonderful job. It was really fascinating to get different perspectives, because we often talk a lot within our own country about different issues, but to take a look at other perspectives and representing all the regions really makes it quite important for us. A couple of takeaways from me, and again, this is around the issue we discussed in the pre-session about containment versus coexistence. And I love the idea of you need some sort of containment to ensure coexistence. So I guess for us, we have to really consider what that strategy is from a Canadian perspective. What does the containment mean in terms of hard power, and how is that going to be manifest, given that we only have so many assets to do that? And I think that's an important thing for us to think about. The other thing that came to me, and this is from my own experience, I've been in China for 4 years and Taiwan for 4 years, so Greater China for 8 in total, is the one thing that Canada had in China was a huge reserve of goodwill on the asset, on the balance sheet. But goodwill is goodwill, right? It didn't really necessarily translate into other things that are emerging. The problem we have now in the context of not just with China, but certainly within Canada, that asset class, that goodwill has basically evaporated. And the reality is we need to be able to understand how best to cope with that. And this is something that I think is very, very important. One thing which I might have pressed a little bit with all of you is the issue of the role of governance and governance structures, and how we can bring some sort of order around forward-looking type of activities. And we're doing a lot of work in the digital governance space, for example. And this is going to be important in terms of setting standards going forward. And I think Canada can play a big role in that. And that is, in a sense, a hard power approach to dealing with this issue. So again, I want to say thank you very much. This has been a very enlightening and inspiring conversation, and we really appreciate the fact that you were able to take this much time with us today. And I hope others who that were joining this conversation found the same benefit that I've had. So thank you very much, and thank you, Jeff, again for your good work in moderating, and thank you for the Asia Pacific of Canada team for organizing this session. So as a last thought, let's keep thinking about the two Michaels. They're very important. Thank you. Okay.